November 1918. The guns had finally fallen silent. After more than 4 years of bloodshed, World War I was over. Across Europe, people poured into the streets to celebrate. Church bells rang, flags waved in the wind, and millions believed that peace had finally arrived. But in Germany, there was no celebration. There was only silence. German soldiers returned home expecting gratitude, only to find a nation shattered beyond recognition. Families were struggling to survive, food was running out, jobs were disappearing, and an entire generation was left wondering how one of the most powerful nations in Europe had fallen to its knees. For many Germans, defeat was painful, but what came next was even worse. Within a few short years, Germany would be pushed into humiliation, economic collapse, and social chaos. The anger would grow, the resentment would spread, and deep inside the heart of a broken nation, a dangerous desire for revenge would begin to take shape. What nobody realized at the time was that these wounds would not stay buried forever, because from the ashes of defeat, a movement would rise, a movement that would change Germany, change Europe, and eventually drag the entire world into an even deadlier war. This is the story of how Germany's defeat became Germany's revenge. When World War I ended in November 1918, Germany was no longer the powerful empire that had once challenged the world's greatest nations. The country that had marched into war dreaming of victory now stood exhausted, defeated, and broken. Across Germany, thousands of soldiers returned home after years of fighting in brutal trenches, surviving hunger, disease, and endless artillery fire. They had sacrificed everything for their country, but instead of returning to celebrations, they found empty stores, struggling families, and a nation drowning in uncertainty. The Germany they came back to was almost unrecognizable. Factories were slowing down, businesses were failing, and many families struggled to afford even basic necessities. The pride that had once defined the nation seemed to have disappeared. Everywhere people looked, they saw the scars of a war that had taken millions of lives and shattered an entire generation. But for many Germans, the most painful wound was not the destruction around them, it was the confusion. For years, they had been told that Germany was holding strong. Newspapers spoke of courage and sacrifice. Soldiers believed they were still fighting for victory. Yet suddenly the war was over, and defeat had arrived without warning. Many felt shocked, others felt betrayed. As frustration spread, so did rumors. Some believed Germany had not truly been defeated on the battlefield. Others blamed politicians and powerful figures for weakening the country from within. Whether those claims were true or not mattered less than one simple fact. Millions of angry people were searching for someone to blame. At the same time, Germany's political system was falling apart. Kaiser Wilhelm II had stepped down and fled into exile. The old empire had collapsed, and a fragile new government struggled to maintain control. Protests erupted in major cities, political groups fought for influence, and fears of revolution spread across the nation. Germany had lost more than a war. It had lost confidence in itself. And as fear, anger, and humiliation continued to grow, the country was about to face a punishment even more devastating than defeat itself, a punishment that would leave a deep scar on the German people and ignite a desire for revenge that would shape the future of Europe. That punishment was waiting in Versailles. In the summer of 1919, while Germany struggled to recover from the devastation of war, its future was being decided inside the Palace of Versailles near Paris. Leaders from Britain, France, the United States, and other allied nations gathered to determine the fate of the defeated powers. What appeared to be a peace conference was, in reality, a meeting that would reshape Europe for decades to come. Back in Germany, people waited anxiously for the outcome. Many expected harsh terms, but they also hoped for fairness. After all, millions had died, cities had been destroyed, and families across Europe had suffered unimaginable losses. Surely the war itself had been punishment enough. They were wrong. When German representatives arrived at Versailles, they quickly realized they were not there to negotiate. The terms had already been written. Germany had been given only one choice: accept them. The treaty placed responsibility for the war on Germany and its allies, a decision that many Germans viewed as a national humiliation. But the blame was only the beginning. Germany was ordered to pay enormous reparations at a time when its economy was already struggling to survive. To many citizens, the burden seemed impossible. Then came the territorial losses. Valuable land was surrendered, overseas colonies were lost, and millions of ethnic Germans suddenly found themselves living outside Germany's borders. Every concession felt like another piece of the nation being stripped away. The military restrictions were equally devastating. Germany's army was drastically reduced, while tanks, military aircraft, and submarines were banned. A military that had once symbolized national pride was reduced to a shadow of its former strength. As newspapers revealed the details of the treaty, anger spread across the country. What was presented as a peace agreement felt, to many Germans, like a punishment designed to keep Germany weak forever. Conversations in homes, factories, and cafes all revolved around the same question: how could Germany ever recover from this? But the treaty created more than hardship. It created resentment, a resentment that quietly grew in the hearts of millions. And among those millions was a former soldier who believed Germany had been betrayed, a man who would soon learn how to transform anger into power. His name was Adolf Hitler. If the Treaty of Versailles wounded Germany, the years that followed made that wound even deeper. At first, many Germans believed their country would eventually recover. Germany still had skilled workers, powerful industries, and a proud population determined to rebuild. But recovery proved far more difficult than anyone expected. As the government struggled to pay reparations and stabilize the economy, financial pressures spread across the nation. Businesses suffered, unemployment increased, and confidence in the future began to fade. Then, in 1923, Germany was hit by one of the worst economic disasters in modern history. The value of the German currency collapsed. At first, prices rose gradually. Then they exploded. Within months, money was losing value so quickly that workers rushed to spend their wages the moment they were paid. Shopkeepers changed prices several times a day. Families carried bags full of banknotes just to buy basic food. Savings that had taken years to build disappeared almost overnight. For ordinary Germans, it felt like watching their future vanish before their eyes. Stories from that period sounded almost unbelievable. Some people pushed wheelbarrows filled with cash through the streets because their money could no longer fit into their pockets. In some cases, banknotes became so worthless that people burned them for heat instead of spending them. Everywhere people looked, they saw humiliation. Retired workers could no longer afford bread. Business owners watched their life's work collapse. Parents lay awake at night wondering how they would feed their children the next day. And as suffering increased, so did anger. People wanted answers. They wanted someone to blame. Was it the government, the Treaty of Versailles, foreign powers? No one seemed to agree. But one thing was certain: millions of Germans were losing faith in the leaders who promised solutions and delivered only more hardship. That frustration created something dangerous. When people lose hope, they become willing to listen to voices they would normally ignore. Across Germany, radical political groups began attracting larger crowds. They promised national pride, revenge, and a return to greatness. Most people dismissed them at first, but as conditions worsened, fewer people were laughing, because desperate nations often make desperate choices. And in Munich, one former soldier was watching the anger spread across the country. He understood something many politicians did not. People were no longer looking for explanations. They were looking for someone to believe in, and soon he would step forward to offer exactly that. By the mid-1920s, Germany was no longer just a nation in crisis. It had become a nation searching for a savior. Years of defeat, humiliation, and economic hardship had shattered public confidence. Many Germans had lost faith in traditional politicians, who seemed to offer endless promises, but few real solutions. While ordinary families struggled to rebuild their lives, political divisions grew deeper. Rival groups clashed in the streets, public rallies became increasingly hostile, and the country felt more divided than ever. In the middle of this chaos, a little-known political speaker from Munich began attracting attention. At first, few people took him seriously. He wasn't wealthy, powerful, or connected to Germany's elite. Most people outside Munich had never even heard his name, but he possessed something far more dangerous. He understood how to speak to angry people. While other politicians focused on policies and complicated economic plans, he focused on emotions. He spoke about national humiliation, betrayal, and the promise of restoring Germany's lost pride. His message was simple, direct, and easy to understand. For millions of frustrated Germans, that made him impossible to ignore. As his speeches spread, so did his audience. People who felt abandoned by the political system began listening. Those who felt powerless finally heard someone speaking directly to their fears and frustrations. He projected confidence at a time when Germany was filled with uncertainty, and to many listeners, he sounded like a man with answers. For a brief period, it seemed Germany might stabilize before extremist movements could gain real influence. The economy showed signs of improvement, and hopes of recovery slowly returned. But the wounds of defeat had never truly healed. Then, in 1929, everything changed. The global economy collapsed, banks failed, businesses shut down, and millions lost their jobs. The fragile stability Germany had worked so hard to rebuild disappeared almost overnight. Fear returned to the streets. Families once again worried about survival, and once again, people searched for someone who could promise a better future. This time, the man from Munich was ready. For years, he had been building support, refining his message, and waiting for the perfect opportunity. Now, as Germany fell into crisis once more, he stepped out of the shadows and onto the national stage. Before long, the entire world would know his name, Adolf Hitler. As the Great Depression tightened its grip on Germany, millions of people found themselves facing another devastating crisis. Factories closed, businesses collapsed, and unemployment soared. Families who had already endured war, humiliation, and economic disaster now watched their hopes disappear once again. Across the country, frustration turned into desperation. The government seemed unable to stop the decline. Politicians continued to argue while ordinary citizens struggled to survive. Every day brought new uncertainty, and with it came a growing desire for change. This was the moment Adolf Hitler had been waiting for. No longer confined to small meetings in Munich, he now traveled across Germany, speaking to larger crowds and gaining new supporters with every rally. Unlike traditional politicians, Hitler offered something many Germans desperately wanted: certainty. His message was simple. Germany had been humiliated. Germany had been betrayed. Germany had been weakened, and Germany could rise again. For millions facing unemployment and hardship, those words were powerful. Hitler understood that people living in fear were not searching for complex solutions. They were searching for hope, confidence, and someone who appeared capable of taking control. Crowds grew rapidly. Small gatherings turned into massive rallies. His supporters filled public squares, meeting halls, and city streets. Through speeches, propaganda, posters, and carefully organized events, the Nazi Party created the image of a movement that seemed strong, disciplined, and unstoppable. Many Germans did not support Hitler for the same reasons. Some wanted jobs, others wanted stability. Some wanted national pride restored, but together they formed a growing political force that was changing Germany's future. Election after election, Hitler's influence expanded. The anger that had been building since 1918 was finally finding a leader. The humiliation of Versailles, the economic collapse, the years of frustration, the desire for revenge, all of it was being channeled into one movement. By the early 1930s, Adolf Hitler was no longer just another political figure. He had become the voice of millions. And what began as the suffering of a defeated nation was about to transform into something far more dangerous. Germany was no longer searching for a savior. It believed it had found one. For more than a decade, Germany had endured one disaster after another: defeat, humiliation, economic collapse, and finally desperation. What began in the trenches of World War I had slowly transformed into something far more dangerous. Millions of Germans had lost faith in the system that promised stability, but delivered only hardship. The anger created by defeat, the resentment born at Versailles, and the suffering caused by the economic crisis had all been building toward a single moment, and Adolf Hitler was ready to seize it. By the early 1930s, he was no longer an unknown speaker from Munich. He had become one of the most influential figures in Germany. To his supporters, he represented hope, strength, and national renewal. To his opponents, he represented a growing threat to democracy. But whether people supported him or feared him, one fact could no longer be ignored. Germany was changing, and it was changing fast. While much of the world watched from a distance, few realized what was about to happen next. Many believed Hitler would fade away like countless politicians before him. They were wrong. Because Germany's revenge story was only beginning. A wounded nation had found a leader. A leader had found millions willing to follow him, and together, they were about to change the course of history. In the next episode, we'll uncover the unbelievable rise of Adolf Hitler, from a struggling and unknown man to the most powerful figure in Germany. How did he win the trust of millions? How did he transform a political movement into a national force? And how did one man set Germany on the path toward another world war? The answers await in the next chapter. And that is where the real story begins.